It's Friday on Daily Delivery. I'm Michael Rand. Glad to have you guys back for another day and a really good show coming up. My pleasure to have Glen Perkins, former Twins pitcher, longtime teammate of recently elected Hall of Famer Joe Mauer, and current Twins radio and TV analyst on with me here in just a few minutes. Glen Perkins and I will talk about Mauer quite a bit, his recollections of playing with Mauer, what made him so great, some good stories in there about Mauer, and, you know, Mauer the guy, Mauer the player, Mauer the ping pong player, and things like that. So stick around for that in just a little while. And a good discussion, too, of the 2024 Twins, what Glen Perkins likes about them, maybe one thing he might like to see them add still, and his thoughts on rising star Royce Lewis, like Joe Mauer, a number one overall pick who has a great amount of potential. Not going to put him on a Hall of Fame track yet, but hey, you never know. The sky is seemingly the limit for Royce Lewis right now after his 2023 real debut. So that's coming up in a few minutes. Got some NFL coaching thoughts at the end of the show, as well as maybe a couple extra Mauer thoughts of my own. First, though, what did I miss? Going to be kind of results heavy in the top part of the show here. The Wild and Wolves played last night, and they both gave me thoughts on kind of the bigger picture. The Wolves beat the Nets. Wasn't pretty. 96-94. It's like they took a time machine to the mid-90s and played a game in the mid-90s. This game might as well have been in New Jersey, not Brooklyn, if they were going to do it that way. Wolves took a big lead, didn't really execute all that well down the stretch, hung on, and won. Like I said, 96-94. Not aesthetically pleasing. They got a nice play to take the lead with about a minute left. Karl-Anthony Towns got the basketball kind of at the top of the key. Pump faked, goes to the basket, draws defense, lob to Rudy Gobert, dunk. That turns out to be the last 2 points of the game. Wolves hold on when the Nets miss some free throws in the final seconds. So, you look at it one way and you say, the Nets aren't very good. The Wolves didn't really do well down the stretch. Kind of got fortunate to hang on for this one. Are they really playing their best? You know, there's some grumbling going on about this team, and I've done it a little bit too. Like, there's some grumbling, especially when they lost to the Hornets the other day. Like, what are they doing? What's going on here? So there's some of that going on right now. I would say, though, in the bigger picture, yeah, you want to see them execute better down the stretch. You want to see them be able to turn it on to a higher dial as the season goes on and you get closer to the playoffs. But I would say right now that the two things that matter most are, A, keep stacking up these wins. Show that you can do this over the course of a full season, that it's not just a hot start, that you're not just a team that's going to go on a nice 40 or 50 game run but then fade. It's more important that you win right now than you gain style points, because the other very important thing here is you got to play for playoff seeding right now. The West is absolutely loaded right now. There's going to be a hard team no matter where you finish, but they are certainly trending for a top four finish in the West right now. I mean, they're the number one seed right now. They reclaimed that position from Oklahoma City. They'd been in it for pretty much the whole year, or most of the year anyway, but they lost it after a loss the other day. They've got it back now after back-to-back wins these last two road games. So they've took that back over after those wins over Washington and Brooklyn, 32-13. So they're clear of everybody, definitely in the top four conversation to get that home playoff game. Like I said, it's going to be a tough matchup. Like, the Lakers are lingering down there, the Warriors, teams with championship pedigrees, other rising teams. Like, it's going to be a hard matchup, but you got to get a top four playoff seed. You got to show that you are in that mix now, that you've taken that step, that you're certainly not play-in material, but of the pedigree now, that you are going to get a top four seed, have that home court in the playoffs, play a team that you should beat in the first round. And that's like bare minimum expectations this year. Top four finish, advance at least one round in the playoffs. That was kind of the goal last year. They're kind of one year behind because last year didn't go the way they wanted to, right? They had a hard time gelling. Cat got hurt. It wasn't entirely like a lost season. They got information, but it wasn't the year they wanted to have. So this is the year right now they thought they would have last year, and they've got to show it right now. Can they get to that point? So getting to that point means winning ugly sometimes. It means winning games when you are not at your best, and they've got enough ways to win. You know, they haven't been shooting great lately. They haven't been executing down the stretch, but they've been rebounding well. They've been getting second chance points. They've been getting some of these other kind of defensive factors at key moments that's kind of been their story of the year to carry them. So they've got enough ways to win. They have to stay focused enough to do it, and they have to keep this kind of winning momentum going, even if it's not always going to be pretty. Now, speaking of not always pretty, the Wild, their situation, complete opposite. They're kind of in the spot the Wolves have been in recent years, where they're kind of clinging to the fringes of a playoff race, and it didn't go well on Thursday. A big one against Nashville. Sarah McClellan and I previewed not just this game, but kind of what's at stake the rest of the year, how this team has been so up and down. They took a 1-0 lead into the third period against Nashville, a team that's directly above them in the wild card standings. A situation like that, players talked about it after the game. You'd like to think you can win. In fact, the Wild have been very good in those situations this season. I think 14-0-1 prior to this game when leading going into the third period. This is the first regulation loss they have had all season when carrying a lead into the third period. A bad time for it. They've only got one game now before the break, before the All-Star game. Bunch of games against, division opponents, teams they're chasing in this wild card race right after the break. So we'll see what they have kind of left in the tank, but disappointing in that game, right? Like they carry that lead and then give up two quick goals really early in the third period, very, 30, 40 seconds apart, whatever it ended up being. That's disappointing. I think they're disappointed in that. It's not always about, the effort for them, right? It's about results. They've got to get results. They're chasing points. Those were points that were a big swing. Instead of being 2 back of Nashville, which would have been the case had they won in regulation, they are 6 back of Nashville. One of those huge 4-point swing games. The Wild don't get it. Not like time is completely gone, but you can't have too many more of those 4-point swings go against you in the second part of the season after the break before things are going to be basically no playoffs, playing for what's going to happen at the trade deadline and what's going to happen next year before you're finally out from under this whole salary cap jail in 25-26.
Grand Casino would like to take a moment and salute the true football fan. The passion, the hope, the anticipation, that incomparable feeling of winning. Grand Casino would also like to take a moment to remind you that you can find all that anticipation, thrill, and winning at Grand Casino. Grand Casino, let your story begin.
I've got former Twins pitcher and current radio and TV analyst Glen Perkins with me today. Longtime teammate of Joe Mauer, battery mate for quite some time on a lot of those teams. And I want to talk Twins and Joe with you. How you doing, Glenn?
I am good. It's been a good winter, a warm winter. And getting the news the other day about Joe was absolutely fantastic. And I'm just ecstatic for him.
You were his teammate. Before we started recording, you kind of framed it nicely, like he was there before you got there and he was still there after you were finished. And 06 was when you debuted, and that was kind of like the real beginning of like Mauer mania. Of course there was like the draft, and then he debuted in 2004, but he got hurt. His 2005 season was good, but like 2006 he hit 347. He wins his first batting title. Like that's quite an accomplishment. That's like quite a welcome to the big leagues.
Well, yeah, he was always a couple steps ahead of me in every respect. And getting drafted out of high school, getting to the big leagues the year that I got drafted, I was still in college when he debuted. So I've always been playing catch up with him, and obviously never caught him, and nobody that I played with in those times even approached anything close to what Joe was able to accomplish. And but it was just an honor to share a field with him. I echoed that to him. I told him that. I talked to him the morning of the announcement and then texted him after. and then exchanged some texts with him yesterday. And that's basically what I said is there was no better to ride the coattails of than you, and just proud to be a teammate of his.
You obviously you don't think about this while you're playing. You're playing with a great player. You're playing with a batting champ, an MVP eventually in 2009. A 3-time batting champ. Did you think he as you're playing with him, are you thinking, man, I might be playing with a future Hall of Famer? Or did you see that arc for him quickly just because of how good he was?
It doesn't ever feel that way, no, because it's like your kids. You don't notice that your kids are growing up because you're with them all the time. If you don't see a friend's kid for 5 years and then you see him again, you're like, holy cow, you were a foot shorter the last time I saw you. Right. You would maybe notice it, but being with him the entire time, I think it's that you get used to seeing him play, and it's just he's a teammate. He's a really good teammate. He's just a guy. He's a guy in the clubhouse. He was different. He was special. We knew all of those things, and that was obvious. But you don't visualize it in the same way. And I think the best way for me to put it is like when I first came up, I pitched against Frank Thomas.
Okay.
And I'm out on the mound and I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is the guy that I watched in the 90s. Like he was the best player in the 90s, and now I'm facing him. Like, what am I doing out here? This is really weird. I pitched against, or I played with Jim Tomei for a year and a half. I'm friends with Jim. You know that he's going to be in the Hall of Fame, but when he's in, then out, and then in the Hall of Fame, you're a little bit more awestruck by him. But growing up in the game with Joe, being a leader on the team with Joe, you don't get that same sense. But and I feel like maybe that's why it hasn't quite sunk in for me that he's in that class of players. He's a guy that kids for the next 100 years are going to go to Cooperstown and see and talk about Joe Mauer. But I think it's also just a testament to him and how he was able to handle himself in a clubhouse, that he never put himself above anybody else either, that he fit into the clubhouse the same way any other role player would. And I think that's what made him such a great teammate.
Personality-wise, I don't feel like we ever got all that close to him, not because he was, resistant. It's just his personality is kind of one of, the joke is like boring Joe Mauer, right? Like he's predictable. He's kind of got this kind of, he's this quintessential Minnesotan, great guy, but kind of what you see is kind of what you get. But you knew him probably better than so many of us. What was Joe like, in the clubhouse, behind the scenes? Was it the same, or did he cut loose a little bit more? What do you remember of him from that regard?
He's definitely not a guy that cut loose. I think there's more to him than what the media knows, than what the general public knows. There's no question about that. But put yourself in his situation, being a generational talent, ends up getting drafted by his hometown team. You have to put up walls. You have to be guarded. He had to take certain measures from the time he was 18 years old to protect himself and to protect his family. And that just became part of who he was. But you hear stories about him and how good of a teammate he was, how good of a leader he was. He wasn't the guy that was going to get up in front of the team and yell and motivate in that way. He was a guy that if you followed what he did, if you paid attention to what he did day in and day out and did those things, you were going to be a better player. You were going to be a better teammate. You were going to be a better person. That's the way I think that he led the Minnesota Twins for the 15 years or whatever it was of his career. It was a not a vocal guy, but a lead by example guy. And that's just his personality. I think, there was, like I said, certain walls that he put up, but also his personality isn't one to be super outgoing. But he's friendly to everybody. He's genuine as can be. There was no facade with Joe. And he's when people ask me what is he actually like, I do tell them, you kind of know him. You know who he is, who he was outwardly to the public, to the media. Truly at his core is who he is. Just a really genuinely nice guy that I think is like any other Minnesotan, and he just happened to be uber talented at baseball.
One thing that I think maybe we forget about sometimes, and maybe was one of the things, kind of the if there's like a tiebreaker or a thing that like you look at and you say, okay, like he's got all these things on his resume and he has this, is Joe Mauer was a hell of a catcher. Like defensively, he was like one of the best. He caught you, I'm sure, numerous times. What made him so good as a receiver?
I think that, when he started, when he came up, when I came up, there was no metrics, there was no strike zone judging or grading. The strike zone was based on who was on the mound, who was at the plate, and who was behind the plate, as far as the catcher goes. And so when you had Joe back there, that was a really nice guy that got along with the umpires, that had a reputation as a guy that knew the strike zone as a hitter. He was going to get you calls. But when you actually watch him receive the ball, I think that teams, even today, with the way that they analyze and the way that they coach catching, could watch videos of Joe Mauer. He just did all the things naturally that they try to teach guys to do now, with where you position your glove, how you frame pitches, how you pull pitches back into the zone. He did all of those things without having any idea that 20 years down the road, this is how catching was going to be taught. And this is how we were going to try to trick umpires. He was able to do that just based on natural talent. And I think then once I transitioned to the bullpen and started throwing fastballs up in the zone, when I realized that this is where I was going to have success, it just so happened that he was 6'5" behind the plate and was a little bit taller, bigger of a target, and I could throw the ball right at his mask. And he could set up on the inside corner. If I hit him in the face, they weren't going to be able to touch me. And so it just became incredibly easy for me to work with him. But he was and is one of the best catchers, one of the best receiving catchers of all time. It got overshadowed by how good he was at the plate. Everybody would say he's a catcher, but he can hit like a third baseman, a first baseman, a corner outfielder. His catching ability got overshadowed by that, even though he did win Gold Gloves. But he was, like I said, he was one of the best catchers in baseball history.
You think because, and I asked Lavelle this the other day, do you think because he was, naturally, but also worked on it, so good at pretty much everything that we took some of what he did for granted, even while we were watching it? Like, not necessarily you, or a teammate, but like people who were watching his career unfold is like, oh yeah, that's just what Joe does.
He was very easy to take for granted. And I think maybe that's why I don't have the same awestruckness about him that I do about Frank Thomas or Jim Thome, because he just went about his business. I was joking with Gardy last night in Fargo. There's never been a guy that played for as long as he did and was as successful as he was that didn't have to make an adjustment. He was the perfect hitter and the perfect baseball player from the moment he stepped on the field, probably as like a 5-year-old. And he just was able to do what he did, and it came so naturally to him. So yeah, I think that we all took him for granted, and part of that is it just looked so easy. He worked as hard as anybody I ever played with. Don't get me wrong, but when he was on the field, it was so natural and so easy for him that he almost in a way blended in. But I think the best kind of story that I have about that, the most eye-opening thing for me, was in 2013. Mm-hmm. We were with the World Baseball Classic, Team USA, and I'm standing out in left field with Craig Kimbrell, who at the time was as nasty as any pitcher in baseball. And Joe's hitting in the cage, and he says, I don't know how I would ever get this guy out. And I'm thinking, like, well, Craig, you throw 100 with an absolute hammer curveball, like that will probably get him out. And he's like, said he is the best hitter I have ever seen. And that's when it made me realize and appreciate, like, okay, this guy, I am taking him for granted. And that's it goes back to that where you don't realize it when you get to see him play every day. But I think the perception outside of Minnesota, that's why he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. I think that the national media, the national perception of him was very different than the perception inside of this state.
Obviously, a Hall of Fame baseball player, was a top, national quarterback recruit in high school, could have gone to Florida State, which was like the program at the time. He was like a really good basketball player, probably could have played at least like mid-major college basketball, if not higher. And I've also heard that he is maybe one of the best ping pong table tennis players ever. Have you witnessed that portion of the Joe Mauer repertoire?
Yeah, we actually used to travel with a miniature ping pong table.
Is that true? Okay.
Yes, and we would set it up I would set it up in my room, and he would come over on the road, and we would play ping pong on a miniature table. I mean, you can imagine he can hit baseballs traveling 100 plus miles an hour. He can recognize spin on baseballs traveling 90 plus miles an hour. Like I could hang with him, but I would say if we played 100 games, he was going to win 95.
Sure.
But he's good at everything he does. He truly is. Like that's not exaggerating. Like there is nothing that he's not good at, but that's what happens when you have supernatural eyesight, hand-eye coordination, and athletic ability.
A couple more things on Joe that I want to ask you a couple things about this year's team. And you guys you mentioned to me, I said, you guys are pretty close in age. You said, yeah, 6 weeks apart. Didn't realize it was that close, but you guys were like high school contemporaries, even if you didn't compete in the same league, play against each other. But the mythology of Joe was kind of already building at that point. Obviously, he was so good at Cretin, becomes the number one overall pick of the Twins. Like what? It kind of almost boggles my mind that someone with kind of those expectations, even with those credentials, that his career plays out in the way that he becomes a first ballot Hall of Famer. Like it's almost like you think it could happen when it's at the origin, but so many things happen to so many players along the way that it rarely ever works out that way.
You truly couldn't make up his story. Like no movie writer, no script writer could write this script. You just can't. All of the things that had to come together for it to happen are impossible. And not to mention the fact that how do you get that good in Minnesota when we're sitting here on January 25th, right. And there's snow on the ground and it's not as cold as it normally is, but to be able to do what he did, to be able to get as good as he did from here is impossible. But the entire story is that's Joe. He's supernatural. He's one of his nicknames was Super Joe. Yeah. And that's why he was able to do it. Like nobody else could have done that except Joe Mauer.
You were a lefty. He's a lefty. One last thing. If you were going to try to get him out at your heyday and his heyday, how would you approach Joe Mauer?
See, the only guy that ever could get him out consistently was James Shields, and that's because he had a really good changeup, and he would fall behind like 2-1 or 3-1 and then throw a changeup down and away. I don't know what I would have done with him. I think any tough lefty that I ever faced that had good strike zone control, that wouldn't chase, that didn't swing and miss, I would just try to elevate fastballs and hope they hit it in the air. I would try to get Joe to hit it in the air. It would probably be more for me. Like I would have done what the Royals did, and I would have put the center fielder in left center, and I would have put the left fielder on the left field line and just hope that he hit a line drive to one of those guys. I wasn't going to get him to swing and miss. I wasn't going to get him to chase the slider in the dirt. It would have literally just been like, here's a fastball, hit it at somebody and get yourself out.
That sounds pretty good. Glenn, you're going to do, I think you said to me, 48 games on TV this year as an analyst and 28 on the radio. That's awesome. We love to hear your voice in both of those mediums. You've gotten really good at that over the years. You bring a certain, obviously, player's perspective, but you dive into the analytics. You have a great knowledge for the game. Speaking of that knowledge of the game, what of these 2024 Twins that we know so far, kind of coming off a season where, they kind of took a while to get it going. The pitching was great at the beginning, but it took a while for the hitting to get going. Then all of a sudden they get on a run. They win a playoff series. They kind of break that streak. What about this year intrigues you? And what about this year maybe gives you some caution as to like, hey, I want to see this and this before I'm all in on the 2024 team?
I don't know if there's particularly anything that I want to see. I think that they could benefit from getting one more starting pitcher. And I think that would strengthen their bullpen. If that gives Louis Varland the opportunity to go out there and throw 100 miles an hour, I think that he's a weapon out there. the innings, I think Chris Paddock coming back is going to kind of fill that Kenta Maeda role of 100 to 150 innings, somewhere in that range. I don't think they can lean on him for 32 starts this year. So maybe having a little bit more depth in the rotation. But the top of that rotation is still really good, even without Sonny Gray. I would imagine that we'll see even a more improved version of Joe Ryan. He's another guy that loves to tinker, that loves to make adjustments, that works his butt off in the offseason and throughout the season. But he's always trying to find ways to make himself better. And then they have a guy at the top of the rotation that's in my eyes, one of the top 5 starting pitchers in baseball. And that's not something the Twins have had in 20 years. Johan Santana is the only guy that can maybe surpass Pablo. But if Pablo isn't getting top 3 Cy Young votes at the end of this season, I would be absolutely floored. And so that's a really good place to start from. And I think the offense, what they did in the second half is more indicative of their talent. And they did that without Byron Buxton. A healthy Byron Buxton, obviously, that's a huge question mark, but can change that lineup even further. For me, it's just, other than maybe getting another guy that I think if they could identify somebody that could be this year's version of Pablo, they're a pretty well-rounded team. They have an incredible bullpen, very deep bullpen, that rotation that I mentioned. And if the offense can be more of that second half version, it's a team that should run away with the Central Division. And then they have the top end pitching to compete in a series again. The playoffs are funny. It's not usually the best team that wins in baseball in the playoffs. It's the hottest team, it's the healthiest team, and it's the deepest team. That's what the Rangers were. We saw the Rangers at the end of August, I think maybe in early September. It was like 7 games out of 10 against them, and they looked terrible. Yeah, like the Twins won 6 out of those 7. And then they get hot, they get healthy. They got Jonah Heim back, and they're deep. They're very deep. But the Twins lineup is deep when they're all swinging well, when they're right, when they're healthy. And we saw that in the second half. So hopefully we'll see that from the get-go. But this team can compete the way they're built right now. I think they're projected a top 5 offense, a top 5 starting staff, and a top 5 bullpen. And that's a pretty dang good place to be on January 25th with, I think, some improvements to come.
Joe Ryan taking another step feels like kind of a domino or a key to unlocking a lot of this. At least if they don't bring in a Sonny Gray type replacement.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably number one is getting him to be first half Joe Ryan. Joe Ryan from April 1st to June 21st or whatever it was before that Atlanta start. You always, going into an offseason, when you think about where guys were, it's easier to remember the second half of the season than the first half. Joe Ryan was on pace to start the All-Star game into late June. That's almost 3 months of the season, where he was a lock to go to the All-Star game. He was in the short conversation on the short list to start that game. And I think that's more indicative of the pitcher he is than what we saw maybe in that chunk of games after he came back until later September. So he's a guy that wants to work. He's a guy that wants to be good. And I have a lot of faith in him too. So I think he maybe is more of a linchpin for this team than any other guy. Royce Lewis is a guy that really, he impressed everybody last year. I'm sure you've been around him a bit, at least so far. Like the accolades, you got to be careful because it's such a small sample size. But you start to think, like, is this the next blank? Like his leadership, the way he hit in the playoffs, the way he hit the grand slams when they needed it. Like, what do you make of him at this point? Like, where's the ceiling? Who's the proper comparison in Twins history? Because I gotta watch myself before I get too excited about this guy. He is. He's a superstar. And when you can come up and have an impact like he did, that's what superstars do. This isn't a flash in the pan. Like, he was a number 1 pick. He was a first overall pick for a reason. It's easy to forget that he basically didn't play baseball for 3 years. That's what made last year crazy. Like, that he did that last year on that. Right. And he came up and was one of the best players in baseball immediately. The talent, he's uber talented. It's off the charts. His poise, his makeup, all of those things are off the charts. And he's one of those guys that just has the ability to rise to the occasion. The moment he meets the moment, he exceeds the moment. It never gets too big for him. And he did all of those things, like I said, while basically not having a minor league career. So the sky is absolutely the limit for him. And you just want a kid like that to be able to stay healthy and to be able to get his 500 or 600 plate appearances, because the numbers that he'll put up will blow your mind. He can do everything at the plate that any of the best hitters in baseball can do. He makes contact. His barrel is in the zone. He hits the ball hard. He can hit all of the pitches in all of the locations. And with experience, you got to believe that he's going to get better. And it's hard to believe that a kid like that can get better, but he truly is that good. He's one of those guys. I told the story last night in Fargo. Jim told me in 2011 when he hit the walk-off against Matt Thornton, I had pitched early in that game, and he was walking up and down the dugout like he would do when he was bored in between at-bats. And he looked at me and he said, "Perk, I got a feeling something special is going to happen tonight." And then, an hour later, he hits a walk-off home run. Royce, to me, is that kind of guy. Like, there's very few players that come along that know that they're going to do something special, get that feeling, and then go out there and do something special. Royce Lewis in that first playoff game, I mean, come on. Like, who does that? Who puts a team on his back and lights Target Field on fire the way that he did, other than some guy that is just supernatural?
Last thing, you just mentioned you were in Fargo, you were in Sioux Falls before that, you were on the Caravan, still, of course, very connected to this team, obviously with the analyst roles. And we got Twins Fest this weekend. Camp's only a few weeks away. Like, what's the pulse? How are you feeling the pulse of Twins fans in Sioux Falls and Fargo right now?
They're excited. They're very excited. There was a lot of them that were at those playoff games, which I think was really cool because we were 3-4 hours away from the Twin Cities. And I think that seeing that's what makes Caravan great. When you can get out of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Hennepin, Ramsey County, the surrounding suburbs, when you get away from that and you see how many fans are out there and the questions that they would ask, it was awesome to see their enthusiasm, to see their excitement. And then, the best part, you do these, you're sitting up on a stage in front of all these people and they ask some questions and then they come through the autograph line and you get to have a little bit more of a personal interaction with them. And get even better questions. And they tell you, "I can't wait for this game. I already have my tickets for this series. Are they going to get back to the playoffs? I'm already saving up to go to the playoff games." Like, those are the kind of things that you love to see, but the enthusiasm off the charts. We got a lot of questions about if they're going to make moves because nothing's happened yet. We got a lot of questions about where are we going to be able to watch them. So Those were maybe the concerns, but I think those things will all be addressed before opening day. And but overall, the enthusiasm was great to see.
Awesome. Glen Perkins, appreciate this. As always, be well. Take care. We'll listen to you this season, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Good to be with you, Mike. Thank you.
Royal Credit Union's smart checking accounts offer no monthly fees and no minimum balance. Enjoy financial freedom when you open your Royal Credit Union smart checking account online at rcu.org/go-checking. Insured by NCUA.
Great to catch up with Glen Perkins. Hope you enjoyed that conversation. Couple thoughts I had. One, I liked how he framed the season coming up for the Twins, maybe a little bit more optimistic than I've been lately, than some fans have been lately. You heard Derek Falvey this week talking about, they haven't made many moves yet. They're still kind of wondering what they're going to do because the payroll is in flux, right? They're still waiting to see what's going to happen with the TV situation, like Perkins talked about. But if you just kind of look at the core of this team, about the guys that are coming back, if healthy Buxton, big deal. Obviously healthy Royce Lewis, big deal. If they have all those guys, all those pieces healthy and playing at a high level, yes, this still should be a good team. This still should be a team that is the favorite to win another weak AL Central. But he's higher on some of these guys than I am, or maybe has been around them enough to think, okay, the more good we saw was outweighing whatever bad we saw. Guys like Joe Ryan. If Joe Ryan can be a number 2 starter, and Glenn was right. Like, he was pitching like that for the first half of last season. He's got to put a whole season together. But if he can be that kind of Sonny Gray type for the entire season to go with Pablo Lopez, it takes a lot of the pressure off the rest of that rotation. Then Bailey Ober, Chris Paddock, whoever else they put in the rotation, whether it's Louis Varland, whether it's other options they have still to come, that takes pressure off of them. Someone else doesn't have to be a number 2. They can be a middle to bottom of the rotation guy, eat innings, give you good quality starts, but not have to be depended on to be that kind of pitcher at this point. So that's a big key to me. Good of Glenn to outline that. The other thing that stands out is just thinking about what an athlete Joe Mauer was. We know about the football. Obviously, we know about the baseball. He's a Hall of Famer. We know about the football, number 1 recruit. Florida State could have gone and played quarterback there. There's some fun interplay at when Joe visited the Hall of Fame Thursday. You can read about that at StarTribune.com. He and Todd Helton, both quarterbacks. Helton was a quarterback at Tennessee. Joe obviously didn't play in college, but had the opportunity. And they're kind of joking about who's the better quarterback, toss the football around, stuff like that. You forget, too, Joe was a really good basketball player. He probably, like I said, he could have played college basketball at some level. And then to think about, the ping pong skills. And I love that story about bringing a miniature table on the road, setting it up in your hotel room, playing ping pong. These guys just like going at it, these competitors going at it. And Glen Perkins, again, a guy who can throw a ball 95, 97 miles an hour, extraordinary hand-eye coordination, a good athlete in his own right, saying he can hang with Joe Mauer, but basically he's going to lose 95 out of 100 times to Joe Mauer in ping pong because Joe Mauer is just that good. I think a lot of us think of ourselves as okay athletes. I think of myself as an okay athlete, right? Like growing up, baseball was my sport. I played all the way up through, Legion ball, things like that. Played basketball, like pickup. Played hockey, where you go and skate at the pond. Played all sports, pickup football, tennis, like all golf, like in all of those things. I'm like, okay, I can at least go and not embarrass myself. And in some cases, I'm better at some sports than others. But like to think about being so athletic that basically anything you try, you are automatically right away the best at that thing. That's Joe Mauer. That's just an amazing thing to think about. Just realizing what kind of skills he brought to baseball, how he lent his athletic gifts to that one sport. It's just kind of an amazing thing to think about, especially in the context of Glen Perkins sharing the ping pong story with us today. Let us finish with the cooler. Raheem Morris is the new head coach of the Atlanta Falcons. Interesting in that Bill Belichick interviewed twice for that job. That was believed to be the only job he interviewed for or was serious about. And you heard like the whispers last week, Kirk Cousins getting asked, would you play with Bill Belichick if he was in it, at that point, Atlanta was kind of the presumption. Kirk Cousins saying, I wouldn't turn down a chance to play for a future Hall of Famer, things like that. There's like that little like connections, like, hey, if Belichick gets the Atlanta job, would they be interested in going after Cousins in free agency? Not that that's gone because they hired somebody different, but that connection is certainly gone. So I don't know if you have a Vikings kind of tangential angle to that, but if you think about that, there's no longer that Belichick connection potentially in Atlanta, and there's no Belichick probably anywhere. And I don't know, it's interesting. Like you've got a potential a future Hall of Fame coach, Bill Belichick, and if they decided to go a different direction, decided to go younger, a coordinator, a guy who was the interim coach in Atlanta about 4 years ago before they went a different direction, hired Arthur Smith. So they go back to that direction. The former Rams defensive coordinator. It's just an interesting hire, interesting dynamic at play here. Bill Belichick might not be in the NFL right this year, and if he's not in the NFL this year, who knows if and when he will get another chance, even with his all-time great resume. That'll do it for me today. That'll do it for the week. Plenty of good stuff coming up next week, including Royce on Monday. Until then, I'm Michael Rand, back at it again on Monday.